I remember the sound of engines first. Not the sharp roar of fighters, not the heavy thunder of bombers, but the steady, almost tired hum of twin engines on long patrol. That sound was the background to my early 20s. When other young men heard music or the voices of women, I heard the constant vibration of metal and air, the low song of reconnaissance aircraft crossing an ocean that seemed endless, and, in those first months, hours. My name does not matter. In those days, I was simply a junior naval aviator of the Imperial Japanese Navy, assigned to long-range reconnaissance. On paper, I was part of the eyes of the Empire. In reality, I was a young man with good eyesight, decent flying hands, and a heart full of illusions. I believed in the maps on the walls of the briefing room. I believed in the red circles that spread across the Pacific like blooming flowers. I believed in the older officers who spoke of destiny and spirit, and the divine protection of our islands. At the beginning, the Pacific looked very different from the sky. In late 1941 and early 1942, when I looked down through the canopy, what I saw seemed to confirm everything we had been promised. Isolated American outposts, small clusters of ships, airfields that looked fragile and unfinished. Our own carriers moved with confidence. Our submarines hunted. Our flag appeared on island after island. We whispered the name of the admiral who had planned the great strike at Pearl Harbor as if he were already a legend. My work was simple in description and complex in execution. Take off from a distant airfield while it was still dark. Climb until the sea below became a rippling sheet of metal. Follow a prescribed course that curved across empty water toward a grid square on a chart. Search. Listen to the engines. Watch the fuel gauge with one part of the mind and the horizon with another. Report what was seen or not seen in short-coded messages that vanished into the crackle of the radio. In those first months, the emptiness of the Pacific felt like an ally. There were days when we flew for 8 hours and saw nothing but water, clouds, and our own vapor trails. When we did find something, it was usually small. A lonely freighter that tried to change course when it realized it had been spotted. A pair of enemy destroyers cutting white scars in the blue surface. Once, late in the afternoon, we saw an American cruiser by herself, moving fast, her wake stretching out behind her like a white road. Each sighting felt like proof that our enemies were scattered, disorganized, surprised. On the ground, the mood matched what I saw from the air. At the base, mechanics smoked and laughed as they worked. Intelligence officers pinned fresh photographs on the walls and drew new lines on the maps. Pilots spoke loudly in the mess, playing at cynicism but unable to hide their excitement. The older men complained about food, about paperwork, about the new generation, but their eyes shone when they looked at the situation boards. Everything pointed in one direction: forward. At 20 years old, it was easy to confuse momentum with invincibility. The first small crack in that feeling came not from a great battle, but from numbers on a sheet of paper. It was early 1942. The air over the ocean was clear that morning, the horizon a clean circle. We were flying a sector that intelligence had described as low priority. According to their estimates, American traffic through those waters should have been light, an occasional freighter, perhaps a single escorted transport. Our orders were routine. Cover the assigned sector, report any sightings, return. We found a convoy. At first, it was only smoke on the horizon, not a single thin line from one funnel, but a smudge that thickened and spread. As we approached, ships resolved out of the haze one by one. Rows of them, cargo vessels riding deep, escorts moving like shepherd dogs at the edges. They were not scattered. They were not surprised. Their formation was neat, layered, purposeful. When we banked slightly to count, we stopped at a dozen and knew there were more beyond what the angle allowed us to see. I remember my co-pilot staring down, then glancing at me without words. I remember the way my hand tightened on the control column. I remember the way the escorts turned as one, the faint flicker of anti-aircraft guns reaching upward, too far to touch us but present, like a raised fist at a distance. The radio message we sent back was calm and formulaic. Grid reference, estimated number of merchant ships, estimated number of escorts, course, and speed. Nothing in the words captured the feeling in my chest as I looked down at that steel river moving across the ocean, bringing supplies and men from a continent we had been trained to think of as complacent and slow. When we landed, the sun was already lowering. The debriefing was held in a small, hot room that smelled of sweat and ink. An intelligence officer took our report. He was older than us, with tired eyes and a pen that never stopped moving. We described the convoy in detail. He nodded, wrote, asked a few precise questions, nodded again. When we stepped outside, my co-pilot exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath since we first saw the ships. It was only later, weeks later, that I happened to see the summarized version of that same sighting on a staff chart. The convoy had shrunk. The number of merchant ships was lower by half. The escorts had become an afterthought. The notation in the margin called it moderate traffic. Not heavy, not alarming, moderate. I told myself it was an honest error, a miscalculation, a simplification for higher headquarters. I told myself many things because I still wanted to believe that the people above me always told the truth, at least to themselves. The ocean does not care what anyone believes. It only reflects what moves across it. Through 1942, what moved across it changed. At first, we still saw isolated targets. Then we saw more convoys, more escorts, more wake lines. The silhouettes of American ships became more familiar. The single cruiser of my early flights became groups of them. The lone destroyer became a wolf pack, screening a long line of loaded freighters. We started to see aircraft where before there had been only water, small distant specks that grew larger, closed to a certain point, then turned away, content to let us know that we were being watched in return. The briefings shifted tone slowly, almost imperceptibly. The red circles on the map stopped expanding so quickly. New American bases appeared where there had been none. Where our arrows had once thrust forward without opposition, now they bent, met other arrows, tangled. In the mess, the laughter changed. There were still jokes, but they came faster and ended sooner. Pilots spoke less about glory and more about ranges, fuel, interception times. Mechanics glanced up at low, distant thunder and tried to judge from the note whether it was one of ours or one of theirs. The walls of our world, which had once seemed to stretch out forever, began to feel closer. Yet officially, the language remained the same. We were still advancing. We were still strong in spirit. The Americans were still said to be soft, dependent on machines, incapable of sacrifice. The numbers in the reports grew heavier, but the conclusions remained light. I noticed the difference most sharply because my work forced me to live between two realities. In the air, I saw what was there. On paper, I saw what others chose to write about it. There is a particular report that has stayed with me all my life. It concerned an American task group sighted far from any known base, operating with a confidence that should have disturbed anyone who read the details. The sighting was made by another crew. I was on the ground that day, helping with analysis. The raw message arrived first, then the photographs, gray shapes on darker gray water, their wakes converging, their decks crowded. The identification marks were clear: an aircraft carrier, cruisers, destroyers. Their course carried them along a line that would threaten one of our key positions if they were not checked. We worked through the night in a room full of cigarette smoke and quiet voices. No one could deny what the images showed. No one could argue with the plotted bearings. Our conclusion was simple. The Americans were moving faster, farther, with more confidence than before. By dawn, a summarized version of our report was on the way up the chain. In that version, the estimated strength was lower. The assessed risk was hedged. The language softened. Where we had written that the enemy was demonstrating the ability to project power deeper into our area of operations, the final document spoke of a temporary probing action. I asked the senior intelligence officer about the change. I chose my words carefully. I was still young enough to worry about insolence, but old enough to feel uneasy. He rubbed his eyes and told me in a flat voice that reports must consider morale as well as facts. He said higher headquarters needed to understand the situation without becoming alarmed. He said our duty was to support the will to victory. I nodded because I did not know what else to do. Later, alone, I imagined the American carrier group cutting through the waves without concern for whether our language was gentle or harsh. The sea around them did not care if we were alarmed. It only cared about tonnage, fuel, steel, and reach. There were other signs, small and large. We began to receive more urgent requests for reconnaissance over wider areas. There were days when we flew missions that should have been assigned to 2 or 3 separate crews, but fuel and aircraft were finite, and the demand for information was infinite. The maps on the wall started to fill with more pins, more strings, more colored markings indicating enemy movements that were no longer rare exceptions, but constant patterns. Once, on a long flight far from our nearest base, we crossed a path with another Japanese aircraft at a considerable distance. For a brief moment, our silhouettes must have been mirrored in their eyes as theirs were in ours, two small bugs scratching across an enormous blue surface. I remember thinking that somewhere American crews were having the same thoughts, drawing the same maps, tracking the same convoys. The idea that we alone possessed clear vision began to feel like a superstition. Mishaps accumulated. A supply convoy that should have been safe was attacked with uncanny precision. A forward anchorage considered secure came under air raid from a direction that exposed a gap in our assumptions. Each time we investigated, patterns emerged that were difficult to ignore. Changes in enemy radio discipline, shifts in call signs, altered encryption characteristics. On the surface, these looked like random adjustments. Over weeks and months, they formed a rhythm. I did not yet fully understand what that rhythm meant. I did not yet say to myself in clear language that our enemy might be reading our codes, anticipating our moves before our ships even left harbor. But some part of my mind, the part that listened to static and intervals and absences as much as to words, felt an unease that grew with each new incident. At the same time, the official voice of our world did not change course. Speeches continued. Statements continued. We were told to trust in spirit, in history, in the unique character of our people. We were shown charts that emphasized our victories and blurred our setbacks. Even when the tide of the war began to shift visibly in the island campaigns, the language wrapped those shifts in explanations that always ended with the same promise: final victory, if we endured. For a young reconnaissance pilot, endurance took a specific form. It meant more hours in the air. It meant longer ranges with less margin for error. It meant nursing aging engines over longer stretches of ocean with fewer spare parts waiting at the other end. It meant learning the subtle differences in the silhouettes of new American ship classes because each month brought new shapes to recognize. It meant waking up before dawn with a stomach that twisted in quiet protest, not from fear of battle, but from the dull knowledge that the job demanded more than the tools could comfortably give. I began to realize that there was a gap between what our leaders wanted the war to be and what the war had become. That gap widened slowly like a crack in glass. At first it was barely visible, then it caught the light in certain angles. Then, once noticed, it could not be unseen. Still, I did not speak openly. Most of us did not. We shared glances in the briefing room when a staff officer brushed past a worrying statistic too quickly. We exchanged a few careful sentences in the quiet corners of the hangar, but the walls had ears, and the structure around us was built on the assumption that doubt was almost as dangerous as enemy bombs. So we flew. And we watched, and we reported, and we watched our reports change shape as they climbed upward. Looking back now, many decades later, I can see that the first chapter of my war was not really about oceans and ships and aircraft. It was about learning that there are two kinds of truth in war: the truth of what is actually happening, and the truth that those in power are willing to admit. As a young man, I stood with one foot in each of those worlds. My eyes and instruments told me one story. The maps in the headquarters told another. Between those two stories, my life would eventually be broken and remade. At the time, though, all I knew was that the engines kept turning. The flights kept coming. The convoys below grew larger. The enemy aircraft in the distance grew bolder. The requests for more coverage became more urgent. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen by me, calculations were being made in rooms I would never enter by men who would never smell oil on their hands or salt in their hair, about how to use the men who flew the long, lonely paths over the Pacific when the fuel ran low, when the carriers burned, when the empire needed not eyes, but sacrifices. When the war turned, it did not announce itself with a single explosion. It arrived as a change in weight, the weight of the briefing folders growing thicker, the weight of the circles and arrows on the maps creeping closer to our own bases instead of always pointing outward. The weight in the stomach when the early morning air over the airfield no longer felt like a promise, but like a question. By 1943, I was no longer the boy who had first climbed into a reconnaissance cockpit, believing the Pacific belonged to us. I had flown enough long patrols to know how small an aircraft was against that ocean and how fragile the illusion of control could be. I had watched American convoys grow fatter and more confident. I had seen their warships appear where they were not supposed to be, their wakes cutting across routes that had once been ours alone. I had filled report after report with numbers that did not match the speeches. The first time I truly felt the war tilt under my feet was on a mission that should have been dull. We were tasked to search a sector that intelligence still described as low risk. The charts in the briefing room showed it as lightly trafficked, a backwater where only occasional American ships might appear. The senior officer who delivered the orders repeated the usual phrases: routine patrol, confirm absence of significant enemy forces, conserve fuel, return promptly. Outside, the sky was a clear pale blue, the kind that makes a pilot's hands itch to fly. The engines of our twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft started with familiar reluctance, then settled into that steady vibration that had once comforted me. We lifted off, the runway dropping away, the coastline curving behind us. As always, there was that brief moment when the land fell out of sight and only water filled the world, and I felt suspended above nothing. Hours passed in the way they do on such flights, measured not by clocks but by small rituals. A glance at the fuel gauge every few minutes, a scan of the horizon, then the instruments, then the sea. A note on the chart, a sip of lukewarm tea from a metal flask. The body moved through its tasks while a part of the mind drifted. The first hint was smoke again. Far ahead, not a single thin thread, but a smudge, broad and low, spreading on the horizon like a bruise. I remembered the convoy from the previous year, the way my heart had tightened as more and more hulls resolved out of the haze. I felt that same tightening now, deeper and heavier. As we closed the distance, ships emerged, at first one by one, then in groups. Cargo vessels in orderly rows, their decks loaded high, their hulls deep in the water. Along their edges moved escorts, destroyers, smaller fast ships, their wakes crisp and aggressive. The formation was not that of a scattered convoy. It was precise, layered, professional. These were not panicked merchants fleeing an unexpected threat. This was a column of confidence. We banked to one side to begin counting. 1, 2, 5, 10, more. The numbers climbed beyond what our most pessimistic estimates had suggested for this sector. The escorts, too, were more numerous than expected. Their guns tracked us lazily at first, then with more intent as they realized we were lingering. It was not only the quantity that chilled me. It was the posture. Their anti-aircraft guns were already manned. Their formations shifted smoothly as we circled, closing ranks, presenting overlapping fields of fire should anyone be foolish enough to attack. They moved like men who had done this many times. We climbed a little, staying just outside what we judged to be their effective range. Through the camera lens, the details sharpened, large guns on the escorts, new silhouettes among the merchant ships, more cranes, more lifeboats, more everything. The glass eye of the camera clicked and whirred, capturing frames that would later be spread on a table in a dark room. We transmitted our first contact report in clipped code, then the follow-up with rough counts and course. The radio cracked and hissed, then fell silent again. No voice came back with surprise or alarm, only acknowledgement. On the flight back, I did not speak. My co-pilot did not speak. There was nothing to say that the facts alone did not shout. By the time we touched down, the sun was sinking. The air over the runway shimmered with the day's retained heat. Ground crew rushed forward, their faces curious, waiting for some hint before the formal debrief. I merely nodded and climbed down, legs stiff from hours in the cramped cockpit. The debriefing room felt smaller than before, though its walls had not moved. We spread the photographs under the harsh electric light. Ship after ship, escort after escort, smoke pillars smudging the horizon in gray bands. The intelligence officer on duty that evening was one I knew well. His hair had gone thinner in the past year. The circles under his eyes had deepened. As he examined the images, his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. We went through the formalities: time, bearing, estimated tonnage, composition, course. He wrote and wrote and wrote, filling page after page. Once his pen hesitated over a number, then moved on. When it was over, he stacked the papers, straightened them, and told us we had done well. His voice held no real warmth, only fatigue. As we turned to leave, he stopped me with a small gesture. Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered back toward the operations area under the pretense of checking on weather updates for the next day. Through a slightly open door, I saw the same officer at a long table, the photographs now arranged in a neat grid. Beside him stood a superior, a man from headquarters, his uniform pressed more sharply, his hands too clean. They spoke in low voices. I could not make out the words, but I saw the gesture. The superior tapped one corner of a photograph where the line of convoy seemed to extend beyond the frame. The intelligence officer replied with a small shake of the head. Then, after a pause, a reluctant nod. The pen came out again. Numbers were crossed out, smaller ones written above. In the margin, where we had written that the convoy indicated a significant buildup of enemy logistics in this sector, a new phrase appeared: activity heavier than average, but within expectations. I stepped back into the shadow before anyone could notice me. My heart was beating faster than it had during the flight. The next day, the official situation summary was posted on the board where all could see. It mentioned increased American shipping in the area. It did not mention that the convoy we had seen was the largest yet recorded on that route. It did not mention that the escorts had been numerous enough to warn off any reasonable attack. It did not mention that our estimate of American capacity, at least in that corner of the ocean, had been far too low. A week later, we heard that one of our submarines, dispatched based on the sanitized report, had been lost in that same area. No survivors, no details, only a black mark on a board. The pattern repeated in different forms. A forward anchorage that had been declared relatively safe came under a heavy air raid. Bombers and fighters arrived at a time and from a direction that suggested they knew precisely where our forces were and when they would be most vulnerable. Our coastal observers had sent warnings, but the response had been slow, delayed by disbelief and bureaucracy. The after-action analysis noted that enemy air activity was intensifying. It did not question how the enemy had threaded their way through our supposed defensive net so neatly. On another mission, we were tasked to locate an American carrier group that intelligence believed to be operating within a defined box on the chart. The orders were strict: conserve fuel, sweep the designated area thoroughly, do not deviate. We flew the prescribed pattern, crossed and recrossed the box until the lines on my chart formed a dense lattice. We saw nothing but waves and the occasional distant glint of a solitary ship far outside our zone of interest. Fuel ticked down. The sun arced overhead. Finally, with reluctance, we turned for home, empty-handed. 2 days later, rumors reached us like distant thunder. An American carrier group had launched a powerful strike on one of our outlying positions. They had approached from a direction that put them well outside the box we had been given. Their aircraft had hit targets with ruthless precision. Damage reports spoke of ships burning at anchor, of stores destroyed, of airfields cratered. When we traced their reported course backward on the map, the line cut through an area we had not been assigned to search. It is easy in hindsight to draw a neat line between these events and speak of codes broken, messages read by unseen enemy analysts, our own communications laid bare to foreign eyes. At the time, we did not know the details. What we knew was this: the Americans were often where they should not have been, and not where we expected them. Our orders lagged behind their movements. Their actions suggested a picture of the war that was clearer than the one we were allowed to see. In the operations room, the air thickened with unspoken questions. Maps now showed not only our own formations and bases, but more and more enemy symbols marked in blue or black. Arrows representing American advances pressed deeper into the Pacific, sometimes halted, sometimes bent, but never reverting entirely. On the walls, the red pins indicating our forward reach clustered closer to home with each passing month. The language in briefings shifted from inevitable victory to necessary endurance. Where once we had spoken of striking blows, we now spoke of buying time. Fuel shortages crept into conversations that had once focused on range and payload. Aircraft that would earlier have been rotated out for maintenance flew one more mission, then another. Mechanics did more with less. Pilots accepted more risk as routine. The gap between what my eyes saw and what the official voice said widened to the point where it could no longer be dismissed as perspective. One evening, after a particularly long day of flying and analysis, I was summoned to a small room off the main operations center. Waiting there was the base's intelligence chief, a man whose thin face and uneven shoulders made him look perpetually off balance. Beside him sat a representative from the regional headquarters, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. They asked about our last patrols. I described the convoys, the increased escort density, the new patterns in American radio traffic we had begun to notice. I spoke carefully, choosing verbs that conveyed concern without sounding like panic. The headquarters officer listened in silence, his fingers steepled. When I finished, there was a pause. The intelligence chief cleared his throat and asked if I understood the importance of maintaining morale. I said that I did. He asked if I trusted in ultimate victory. I replied, more slowly, that I trusted in my duty. The headquarters officer smiled thinly at that answer, then told me in a measured tone that analysis was a tool, not a master. He reminded me that statistics could be interpreted in different ways. He said that overemphasis on enemy strength could lead to defeatism, which was as dangerous as any bomb. He suggested that younger officers should be cautious about drawing broad conclusions from limited local observations. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not need to. The meaning was clear. There are things you may notice and things you may say aloud. They are not always the same. As I left the room, my legs felt heavier. Shortly after that conversation, my name disappeared from the regular patrol roster. At first, I thought it was a clerical oversight. Then I saw the new assignment orders. I was to report to a different unit, one being formed for what the documents called Special Attack and Special Reconnaissance Operations. The phrase was new, but everyone understood what it meant. There were whispers about pilots sent on one-way missions, about aircraft loaded with explosives and fuel, about young men praised for their willingness to die in a single brilliant gesture. I had flown long, lonely arcs over the Pacific, bringing back information that others preferred not to see. Now it seemed I was to be used in a different way, not as eyes, but as a weapon that would not return. In theory, the transfer was an honor. In the language of the orders, it was a recognition of my experience, my courage, my proven devotion. In the private space behind my ribs, it felt like something else, a way to silence a mind that had seen too much by feeding its body into the fire. The second chapter of the war for me did not begin with a heroic call to sacrifice. It began in that small room with mild questions and softer threats, with edited reports and redrawn numbers. It began when I understood that the enemy was not only out at sea, in steel hulls and white wakes, but also in the gap between reality and the version of reality that my own commanders were willing to acknowledge. Out over the ocean, the American convoys grew larger. Their carriers ranged farther. Their aircraft appeared in thicker swarms. Each new mission report that tried to capture this shift was sanded, smoothed, made safe for upper eyes. Somewhere, in some room I would never see, others were listening to our messages, plotting our formations, learning our rhythms with cold clarity. I did not yet know their names, those unseen analysts in distant buildings. I did not yet know the full extent to which our own codes had been peeled open like fruit. All I knew was that every time I looked down from the cockpit, the war looked less and less like the one in which I had been told I was fighting. Soon enough, I would be asked not to look down anymore, but to dive. The air in the new unit smelled different, sharper, of fresh paint over old oil, of canvas straps tightened too often, of fear polished into routine. They called it the Special Attack Corps, though no one said the full name aloud. The hangars held aircraft stripped for purpose. No bombs in the usual sense, but fuel tanks crammed into every available space, engines tuned to burn hot and fast, cockpits fitted with extra radios for final transmissions. My own plane waited in a corner, its wings marked with the rising sun, its fuselage lighter than I remembered from reconnaissance days. Mechanics worked silently around it, their hands steady, but their eyes avoiding mine. The orders arrived at dawn, delivered by a junior officer whose voice did not waver. Special reconnaissance ahead of the main formation. Locate the enemy carrier group. Transmit precise position, course, composition. Minimal fuel allocation for the outbound leg. Return not required if mission objectives are met. I read the paper twice. The grid coordinates placed the search area deep in waters we no longer controlled. The fuel load specified would allow outbound flight and transmission, with nothing left for evasion or homeward journey. The phrase "return not required" hung like smoke. In the briefing, the commander stood before a wall map scarred with grease pencil marks. He spoke of duty to the Emperor, of the turning tide that demanded sacrifice from the vanguard. His eyes passed over each pilot without lingering. We were 23 men in that room, most younger than me, their faces smooth and unlined. I wondered if they saw the same arithmetic I did, but no one spoke. To question was to mark yourself as broken before the mission even began. Mine was to be the lead bird. Depart at first light, climb to altitude, sweep the assigned sector until contact or fuel exhaustion. The others would follow in waves, guided by my transmission or their own searches. The commander's hand traced the route on the map, his finger stopping at the search zone as if that were the end of the line, which, I suppose, it was meant to be. That night, I could not sleep. I sat by the cockpit, running hands over the familiar controls now altered for a single purpose. The fuel gauge needle sat full, but I knew its lie. Enough to reach the target area, enough to orbit and observe, not enough to come home. The radio hummed softly when powered, ready to carry my last words across the waves to commanders who would mark my report on their charts and send the next wave after me into the same mechanical slaughter. I thought about the convoys I had seen growing larger year by year, the edited reports, the submarine lost, the quiet conversation in the small room where mild words had sealed my transfer. All of it had led here, to this stripped cockpit and this half-tank of fuel. Around me, other pilots moved through their own rituals. One polished his goggles for the third time. Another wrote a letter he would not be able to mail. A boy who could not have been more than 19 sat cross-legged on the hangar floor, staring at nothing, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. I had been the eyes of the Empire. Now I would be its expendable confirmation. The difference felt important, though I could not have explained why. Dawn broke gray and wind-torn. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, final checks complete. I climbed the short ladder, settled into the seat, felt the harness bite into shoulders that had carried this weight for years. The canopy slid shut with a solid thunk. Engines coughed, then caught, the vibration rising through bones in a rhythm I had known since I was 20. Takeoff was normal. Runway rushed beneath, then fell away. The coastline shrank to a thin line, then vanished. Ocean spread below, unbroken slate under low clouds. I climbed as ordered, instruments steady, the world narrowing to altimeter, compass, horizon. Hours passed in tightening circles. Fuel ticked down, deliberate and unhurried. Each minute was a door closing. No sign of enemy, yet. Radio silence maintained. Thoughts came unbidden. Faces from the old base. The officer who had warned me about morale. The maps that shrank our forward reach month by month. My co-pilot from those early patrols. Dead, now in a mission I had not been told about. Then, far ahead, the telltale smudge. I banked toward it, heart quickening despite everything. As distance closed, shapes resolved. Not a convoy this time, but the real prize. Carriers, gray islands in formation, their decks alive with aircraft. Cruisers screening the flanks, destroyers darting at the edges like hunting dogs. Fighters wheeled overhead, distant specks turning in loose patrol. The scale dwarfed anything from my earlier flights. More carriers than I could count at a glance. 5, 6 visible, perhaps more hidden by formation depth. Escorts thick as reeds. Wake patterns precise, practiced, unhurried. This was no probing force. This was the hammer that would fall on whatever remained of our fleet, and they moved with the confidence of men who knew no one could stop them. I circled high, outside their immediate notice. Camera word, capturing frames that might never be developed. Radio crackled to life. I keyed the microphone, voice calm by long training. Grid reference, enemy carrier group confirmed. Number of carriers at least 6. Heavy escort screen. Estimate 50 plus supporting vessels. Course and speed transmitted in code bursts. Acknowledgement came faint through static. Orders followed. Maintain contact. Transmit updates. Prepare for follow on strike coordination. I almost laughed. Follow on strike. With what? The handful of aircraft we had left would break against this formation like rain against stone. But I transmitted acknowledgement because that was what the voice on the other end needed to hear. Now the escort stirred below. Destroyers turned sharp angles, guns elevating. Fighters climbed toward me, specks growing to shapes with terrible speed. Grumman Hellcats I recognized from silhouettes memorized in briefings that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Fast, maneuverable, armed with 6 heavy machine guns each. I banked away, climbing harder, engines strained under partial fuel load, which at least made the aircraft lighter. Tracers reached up, lazy arcs falling short. One Hellcat closed faster than expected, its wings flashing silver in the weak sun. Cannons stuttered. Rounds punched through wing fabric, close enough to smell cordite through cockpit seals. Damage lights flickered. Oil pressure warning glowed amber. Port engine coughed, then steadied, then coughed again with more conviction. I transmitted damage report, position update, last visual confirmation of enemy course. My voice remained steady. Let them think I was calm. Let them think I was the dutiful weapon they wanted. Fuel needle dipped into red. Orders repeated through the static. Hold position if possible. Transmit bearings for incoming strike force. I could not hold. Smoke trailed from the port engine now. Thin at first, then thicker. Hellcats pressed closer, conserving ammunition, waiting for me to falter. 3 of them now, maybe 4, boxing me in with professional efficiency. Below, the carrier group steamed on, decks launching more aircraft, cranes swinging ordnance to wings. The whole vast mechanism of American naval power grinding forward without even noticing the small Japanese reconnaissance plane bleeding smoke above them. In that moment, clarity cut through chaos like a blade through silk. This was no equal contest. The group below represented power beyond reckoning. Aircraft replaced as fast as lost. Pilots trained in schools that never ran short of fuel. Ships backed by factories that turned out hulls the way our workshops turned out rifle bullets. My transmission, even if received, would guide attacks into that meat grinder. More young pilots, more stripped aircraft, more final flights that would accomplish nothing except to feed the statistics that our commanders refused to see. The port engine seized fully. Starboard faltered, sputtering as fuel starvation began to bite. Altitude bled away in hundreds, then thousands of feet. Fighters backed off slightly, content with their work, escorting me down like pallbearers. I had perhaps 1 minute of controlled flight left, maybe 2 if I was lucky. The carrier group lay below and ahead, close enough now that I could see individual figures on the decks. The doctrine was clear. If you cannot return, make your aircraft count. Aim for a carrier if possible, a cruiser if not. Any target. Do not waste the Emperor's resources by simply falling into the sea. My hand moved toward the control column, ready to push into the dive that would end everything. I could see the approach angle. Pick the nearest carrier, push throttle and stick forward, steepen until the wings scream, hold until impact. It would take perhaps 20 seconds from decision to dissolution, but my hand stopped. I looked down at that vast formation, at the fighters circling, at the guns trained skyward, at the combat air patrol already vectoring toward me with casual proficiency. 1 aircraft already crippled, fuel exhausted, pilot half blind from smoke. Against that, the mathematics were simple. I would not reach the carrier deck. The fighters would shred me before I entered my dive, or the anti-aircraft fire would. Or I would simply lose control and spin into the water between ships, leaving nothing but a splash that would be forgotten before the ripples settled. And even if by some miracle I hit a target, even if I struck a flight deck, 1 aircraft against a fleet that stretched to the horizon would change nothing. They would repair the damage in days, replace whatever was lost in weeks. The war would continue exactly as before, except I would be dead and my voice silenced and 1 more inconvenient witness removed. I had spent 3 years watching the ocean tell truths that headquarters refused to hear. I had seen convoys grow. I had seen our reports edited. I had seen the war turn while we pretended it had not. And now, in my last minute of controlled flight, I understood with perfect clarity that this final mission was not about damaging the enemy. It was about disposing of the pilot who had seen too much. Starboard engine died completely. The aircraft nose down, no longer flying but falling with style. Water rushed up, gray and cold and indifferent. Final transmission, position. Enemy strength overwhelming. Multiple carrier groups. This is not a raid. This is an invasion fleet. Engine failure. Ditching. I did not add the rest. That we never had a chance. That they knew we were coming. That the codes we trusted had been broken long ago. That every move we made was anticipated. That the war was lost and had been lost for years while we flew and died, believing in victory that existed only on edited maps. The radio went silent. Perhaps they heard. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps it did not matter. Impact came hard, sudden, absolute. Wings sheared on contact, aluminum tearing like paper. Fuselage crumpled as it plowed into waves that cared nothing for empires or missions or men who flew them. Water exploded through the canopy, cold beyond description, driving air from lungs. Everything stopped making sense. Up became down. Sound became pressure. The cockpit that had been my world for thousands of hours became a tomb, filling with seawater. Life vest inflated automatically, some engineer's foresight. I clawed toward where I thought the surface might be, lungs screaming, vision narrowing to a tunnel, then a point, then nothing. I woke to hands pulling at harness straps, voices calling in a language I recognized but did not speak. American voices, young, efficient, matter-of-fact. Sky above, gray and vast. Pain in ribs, in left arm, in places I could not identify. I was floating amid wreckage. They hauled me into a small boat. 2 sailors in dark blue, their faces weathered by sun and salt. One wrapped a blanket around shoulders that would not stop shaking. The other tied off a wound on my arm I had not realized was bleeding. Neither showed hatred. Neither showed triumph. Just work. Another task in a day full of tasks. Behind them, impossibly huge, the heavy cruiser that had launched their rescue boat. Beyond that, the carriers I had reported, their decks busy with flight operations. Beyond that, the horizon and more ships and more, until the ocean itself seemed made of steel. They took me aboard the cruiser. Hands guided me below decks, into spaces that smelled of coffee and engine oil and something else, something I could not quite name. Abundance, perhaps. The casual surplus of a nation that built faster than its enemies could destroy. Sick bay was clean, bright, stocked with supplies in quantities I had not seen on our bases in years. A doctor examined the arm, the ribs, shone a light in eyes to check for concussion. He worked with quick proficiency, asking questions through a translator. Name, unit, how many in your formation? Where did you launch from? Standard interrogation wrapped in medical care. I answered some, refused others. It did not seem to matter much. They knew already, or did not care, or had ways of finding out that did not require my cooperation. Days blurred in that sick bay. The cruiser moved, though to where I could not tell. Meals arrived with regularity that felt strange after years of shortages. Rice, vegetables, meat sometimes. More food in a day than I had seen in a week at the Special Attack Base. Other prisoners came and went. Submarine crew, silent and bitter. Downed pilots, some defiant, some broken. A merchant sailor from a torpedoed freighter who wept in his sleep. We did not speak much. What was there to say? On the 5th day, they moved me to a transport. Larger ship, more prisoners, a hold converted to temporary brig with wire mesh and guards who looked as bored as we felt helpless. The ocean passed beneath us, direction unknown. Days and nights measured only by meals and the distant sound of engines. Then, land. Philippines, I learned later, a port city where they processed us like cargo. Forms, photographs, medical checks. Interrogations that were more thorough now, conducted by officers who spoke better Japanese than I spoke English. One of them, older, with thin hair and tired eyes, called me into a small office that might once have been a warehouse foreman's. He gestured to a chair, sat across from me with a folder thick with papers, opened it without ceremony. "You were reconnaissance," he said in careful Japanese. "Long-range maritime patrol." I said nothing. He pulled out a photograph. Aerial view of our base. The hangars, the runway, the operations building. Taken recently, I could tell, because the bomb damage from 2 months prior was visible. "You flew from here," he continued. He pulled out another photograph. A reconnaissance aircraft like mine, captured in flight by a gun camera. The tail markings were clearly visible. Still, I remained silent, though my heart was beating faster. He set the photographs aside and pulled out something else. A map. Not one of ours. An American intelligence map, but it showed our patrol routes. Lines drawn in red pencil, curving across the ocean, marked with dates and grid references. Every major reconnaissance flight from our base for the past 6 months. Every one. We knew, he said simply, where you flew, when you flew, what you were looking for. He pulled out more papers, intercepts, messages in Japanese, then English translations below. I recognized some of them. Orders I had received, reports I had transmitted, casualty notifications, supply requests, all of it laid out in neat typed rows, Japanese on one side, English on the other, as if it had always been meant for their eyes. "Your naval code," he said, and his voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. "We broke it in 1942, before Midway. Everything since then we have been reading. Every order, every position report, every ship movement." He let that settle, watching my face. I thought of Midway, the carriers burning, the admiral's question that reached us even at our distant base. How did they know? I thought of the submarine lost after the convoy report was edited, the air raid on the supposedly safe anchorage, the American task force that appeared exactly where our sanitized intelligence said they would not be. "We did not sink your submarine because we were lucky," the officer continued. "We knew its patrol route before it left port. The air raid, we knew the base coordinates, the timing, what forces were stationed there. Your reports, the ones you wrote, they were accurate. Your commanders, the ones who changed the numbers before sending them higher, they gave us an advantage. We knew the truth. Your leaders did not want to know it." He closed the folder and leaned back. "You saw it," he said. "Long before you were sent on that last mission, you saw that we were stronger, that we were growing stronger, that your position was deteriorating. You reported it, and they made you into a weapon to dispose of, because men who see too clearly are dangerous to those who prefer blindness." I found my voice finally rough from disuse. "Why are you telling me this?" He shrugged. "Because the war will end. Maybe this year, maybe next, but it will end. And when it does, you will go home. Some of you. And maybe you will remember this conversation. Maybe you will tell others that the war was lost not because your soldiers lacked courage, but because your leaders lacked the courage to see clearly. That is worth more than another interrogation about how many aircraft you had left." He stood, gestured to the guard. The conversation was over. Prison camp followed. First in the Philippines, then later, when the fighting moved closer, they shipped us to the American mainland. California, I learned, though I never saw more than the camp itself. Barbed wire, barracks, work details, food that was plain but sufficient, guards who were professional but not cruel. It was neither the torture chamber of propaganda nor the soft paradise of American films. It was simply waiting, month after month, while the war ground to its inevitable conclusion. Rumors filtered through, cities burning under bombing raids whose scale defied comprehension, islands falling one by one, casualty numbers so high they stopped sounding real. Then, in August of 1945, 2 cities erased in flashes brighter than the sun. And finally, surrender. The word reached us through the guards, who spoke more freely once the fighting stopped. The emperor had addressed the nation by radio. The war was over. Japan would accept occupation, disarmament, transformation. I felt nothing at first. Then, slowly, something that was not quite relief, but perhaps its exhausted cousin. Repatriation took months. Processing, screening, waiting for ships. When I finally stepped onto the dock in Yokohama in early 1946, the city I remembered was gone. In its place, ruins and rubble, and crowds of thin people moving through the wreckage like ghosts. My family scattered, father dead in the fire bombings, mother and sister relocated to countryside I had never seen, younger brother missing, presumed killed in the final defense that never came. The house gone entirely, not even the foundation remaining, just a space where a home had been, filled with weeds and ash. There were no honors for special attack survivors, no parades, no medals, no acknowledgement, only whispers. Why did you come back? Why did you not complete your mission? The implication was never stated directly but hung like smoke. I found work eventually, teaching, of all things, mathematics to children who had known only war and its aftermath. I did not speak of my service. What was there to say? That I had flown for an empire that spent lives like currency, that I had seen the war turn years before it ended, that I had been made into a weapon meant to be consumed because the truth I carried was more dangerous than the enemy I was meant to strike. Decades passed, cities rebuilt, children grew. The war became history, then memory, then gradually something that younger generations studied in textbooks that reduced years of pain to clean paragraphs. But nights brought the ocean back, the sound of engines, fuel gauge red, fighters closing, the moment when my hand hovered over the control column, ready to dive, and I chose instead to see the mathematics clearly. One aircraft would change nothing. One death would serve only to silence one voice. I survived not through courage, but through failure. The engine quit before I could complete the mission. The machine betrayed me before I could betray myself. And in that mechanical failure, I found a different kind of truth. Now, old, speaking these words into a recorder whose tape will perhaps be filed and forgotten, I see the full arc clearly. I began as the eyes of the Empire, seeing what those in command preferred not to see. I became a tool, sent not to report, but to confirm inevitable defeat with my death. I survived to witness the ending I had glimpsed from the cockpit years before it arrived. The Americans did not win through spirit or divine favor or destiny. They won through seeing clearly, acting on facts, and replacing losses faster than we could inflict them. We lost through blindness, enforced by men who confused loyalty with truth-telling and preferred maps of desire over maps of reality. That final flight was not heroism. It was arithmetic. One plane against swarm, one voice against the silence of command. I did not dive at the enemy. I fell into the truth they already knew, and we refused to acknowledge. The ocean took my aircraft that day. Time has taken the illusions I carried. What remains is this telling, and the hope that someone listening will remember. The clearest vision comes not from altitude, but from the courage to report what burns below, even when those above prefer not to see the smoke. I am 84 years old now. I sit by the sea sometimes on a bench that faces east, watching the horizon where water meets sky. Modern jets pass overhead, sleek and fast, leaving contrails that fade. The young people walking past do not know what it was to fly a machine stripped for death, to transmit final coordinates to commanders who had already decided your life's value. But the ocean remembers. It holds the wrecks of empires and the bones of men who believed what they were told. And it tells the truth, always, to anyone willing to look down and see. The waves roll in, the gulls call, the sun sets in the west, over an ocean that belongs to no one and everyone. I survived to tell this. That will have to be enough.